You think, he said, it is the spirits of the elements, and I thought perhaps it was the old gods. But I tell you now it is neither. These would be comprehensible entities, for they have relations with men, depending upon them for worship or sacrifice, whereas these beings who are now about us have absolutely nothing to do with mankind. It is mere chance that their space happens just at this spot to touch our own. The mere conception, which his words somehow made so convincing, as I listened to them there in the dark stillness of that lonely island, set me shaking a little all over. I found it impossible to control my movements. "And what do you propose?" I began again. "A sacrifice. A victim. Might save us by distracting them until we could get away," he went on. "Just as the wolves stop to devour the dogs and give the sleigh another start. But I see no chance of any other victim now." I stared blankly at him. The gleam in his eyes was dreadful. Presently, he continued. "It's the willows, of course. The willows mask the others, but the others are feeling about for us. If we let our minds betray our fear, we're lost, lost utterly." He looked at me with an expression so calm, so determined, so sincere, that I no longer had any doubts as to his sanity. He was as sane as any man ever was. "If we can hold out through the night," he added, "we may get off in the daylight unnoticed, or rather, undiscovered." That is from The Willows by Algernon Blackwood. And Algernon Blackwood is your Sunday Penguin for today. And welcome, my friends, once again to stately Vaughan Manor and your Sunday Penguin, where we will be talking about the extraordinary horror and fantasy writer Algernon Blackwood. And this Penguin volume, which is titled Ancient Sorceries and Other Weird Stories, unless you open up the book, and then inside it's called Ancient Sorceries and Other Strange Tales. So whether it's strange tales or weird stories, you decide. It was an odd misprint, and even odder when they reprinted this volume later as a regular Penguin classic. This is a 20th century classic. When they reprinted it later, I think they made that same error, which is an odd thing. But if we're going to have an odd Penguin classic, it might as well be Algernon Blackwood, because some of his stuff, well, it was pretty odd and awesome. So The Willows, which I was reading from right there, that is probably by far Algernon Blackwood's most famous story. Famously, H.P. Lovecraft called that story the finest weird story ever written. And he could be right, because it's really, 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 really good. A fine weird story. This book has a lot of really great Algernon Blackwood stories. Unfortunately, Algernon Blackwood is not read as much as he really should be nowadays. There are only a few volumes available to you if you want to read a physical book. You can get this one from Penguin. I think the Dover Best of Algernon Blackwood is still available. You can get, do I still have? I guess I don't. I had a copy of John Silence, which was his breakout hit. John Silence was a supernatural investigator, which Algernon Blackwood created. There is a John Silence story in here. So yeah, excellent writer. And as for physical books, those are the ones you can get. There's some small press, print on demand stuff you can get. If you've got a Kindle and get the ebooks, you can get everything for like nothing practically, through the wonder of public domain writing from the olden days. You can, just like so many writers, you can get everything this guy wrote for next to nothing, and that's fantastic, because this guy, he was a really good writer. And his two most famous stories are The Willows and probably The Wendigo. The Willows is like in every horror anthology you buy practically. If it's a horror anthology that's covering older stories or the history of horror, or The Willows is probably going to be in there. That has been reprinted over and over, justifiably so. But that is probably the most accessible story. But there are other stories in here that are really good. And I should mention that Algernon Henry Blackwood was born in 1869 in Shooters Hill, Kent. And he died in London in 1951. Great writer. He was fascinated with nature. Nature was both terrifying, awesome, and beautiful to him. And really, he was right. That is pretty much what nature is. Terrifying, beautiful, and dangerous. That's nature for you. And he loved it. He was a avid outdoorsman. He loved to ski. He loved to hike. He did a canoe trip down the Danube, which was his inspiration for the canoe trip that the main characters in The Willows go on. He knew what he was talking about when he described nature and natural settings, because he was there. He spent a good chunk of his life outside. Interesting guy. Aside from writing, he also did a lot of work on the radio and in television. Unfortunately, I don't know that any of his television. He did at least one television broadcast that I know of. I think he might have been on one of the first English television broadcasts, but I don't think that survives. I have heard at least one of his radio broadcasts. Great voice, this guy. Great voice for horror stories. And his stories. The Willows, like I said, is his most famous story. But this Penguin volume also has The Insanity of Jones, Ancient Sorceries, which was that John Silence story. And that is a great story, Ancient Sorceries. When you read that story, if you're familiar with H.P. Lovecraft at all, my last H.P. Lovecraft video was The Shadow over Innsmouth. And I'm convinced that H.P. Lovecraft was at least partially influenced by the story Ancient Sorceries, because there's a lot of that story that is really familiar. If you read both stories, you can see a lot of Ancient Sorceries in Shadow over Innsmouth. And Lovecraft loved this guy, so that's not a surprise. The Man Who Found Out is in this. The Wendigo, like I said, which is a terrifying hunting story that goes terribly wrong, and with a horrific supernatural entity, the Wendigo. The Glamour of the Snow, The Man Whom the Trees Loved, a very strange story. Sand, another really weird one. If you are interested in horror at all, if you're interested in fantasy, definitely you need to check this guy out, because his stories are extraordinarily imaginative. They're like nothing else. And if you've read them, I think you probably know what I'm talking about. They're incredibly well written. He was a very talented man. And there's this wonderful mixture of fear and awe in his stories, which I think inspired Lovecraft in his cosmic stories. It had that Lovecraft's cosmic stories always tried to push the fear and the awe, the terror and the horror and the awesome. And he did it as well in a little more a little more quietly, a little more restrained, certainly. But it was beautifully done. And in stories like The Willows, um, the horror and the awe and the strangeness is just conveyed so wonderfully. Just really, really great stuff. Yeah, so Algernon Blackwood. This, like I said, is the old-timey Penguin 20th Century Classics version of this Penguin Classic, but there is a newer regular Black Spine Penguin Classics version of this, which you can pick up. And like I said, if you've got the Kindle, man, you can get everything for nothing. And I urge you to do it. I urge you to read this guy. Great stuff. Algernon Blackwood. So that was your Sunday Penguin for today. Thank you, my friends. Catch me tomorrow for Mythos Monday, where we journey to the witch house for dreams in the witch house. And then on Tuesday, when we find out which author I will be reading every book by. That'll be exciting. Thank you, my friends. I'll catch you next time.